Hello, Spring Lake Village. This is Nick. So glad to be back. We're already in the month of August, and we're going to begin a new lecture series entitled The Raj Company Ruled India in the Land of the Mughals. So, as I mentioned in the handout describing this new lecture series, I was inspired by the recent PBS series entitled Beecham House, that chronicles the life of one John Beecham, who served in the East India Company. And although his storyline is fictitious, it is set against the backdrop of actual historical events. At the very end of the 18th century, when England was emerging as the dominant player in India. Now, the term Raj comes from the Sanskrit, which is the ancient Indo-European language of the people of India, of the Hindu people. And you'll find that root in Maharaja, for example. Raj literally means rule, and it is, in fact, the term applied to British rule in India, in the subcontinent, but specifically, historians regard the period from 1858, when the British Crown took control over the administration of the subcontinent, to 1947, when India gained her independence. But in fact, the word Raj has also been applied to the long period of India overlordship from about 1600 until 1947, so roughly 350 years. So although the word Raj is defined as rule, in fact, Britain's administration over India was more of an overlordship or a suzerainty over various independent states that had semi-autonomy. So I'm just trying to give you specifically what this term Raj entails. But I wanted to concentrate on this sort of remarkable chapter, sort of period that has been romanticized, this period between 1600 up to 1858. Most documentaries and television series have chronicled the actual British Raj from 1858 and that period in which British imperialism was at its height. But I thought it was much more instructive to examine this seminal chapter in India's history vis-a-vis Britain's entry into India, a time in which there were a number of colonial players who were trying to carve out a stake in the subcontinent, arguably the wealthiest region in all of Asia, even eclipsing the riches of China at the time. Now, when India arrived, India itself was ruled by the Mughals. Mughal is a corruption of the word Mongol, and the Mughal Empire was emerging as the most important of the three surviving Islamic empires. To the west of India was the Safavid Empire, the last flowering of Persian culture, and the Safavids ruled out of the beautiful city of Tabriz. And farther west in Anatolia, present-day Turkey, was the Ottoman Empire, and the sultans of the Ottoman Empire ruled out of Istanbul. Over time, India, of course, would emerge as the wealthiest, most prestigious, and most populous of all Britain's imperial possessions. And it was eventually regarded as the jewel in the crown of the empire. Now, with this new lecture series, I'm going to be providing you a lot more voiceover commentary, maybe a few less slides. I know there have been a few technical issues, so in order to make this more user-friendly, I hope the volume is much better, and you, of course, can adjust your television volume. And the text, I've increased the font size to either 15 or 16 rather than font size 12, so I'm hoping that helps as well. There's nothing quite like the rule of the British in India to be found in history. Historians have often compared it to the Roman Empire, but that's not altogether apropos. I mean, the Roman Empire was situated right in the center of the Mediterranean basin, and it could exert greater control over its vast empire. Britain, a very small country, exerted control, its suzerainty, even though it was some 4,500 miles from the Indian subcontinent. At its height, the Roman Empire during the 2nd century was roughly 120 million, whereas during the height of the Raj, the population of India stood at more than 160, 170 million strong. Of course, today India's population, I think, is approaching 1.4 billion. So roughly 10%, 10 times what it was way back in about the middle of the 17th century. So let's then begin our discussion of this remarkable chapter in Western history. Many of the themes we'll discuss are pertinent even today. The role of imperialism, how does that shape governance? What were the contributions of the British to India, and how did India influence the British people? What impact did it have on the culture and sensibilities of the British people during this long period? Here you see a map of India showing the Mughal Empire from about the middle of the 16th century to its waning years in the early 18th century. The rose-colored territory in the north, which was amassed during the reign of Akbar the Great, consisted of about 15 provinces. The beige region in the south was acquired by Akbar's grandson, Aurangzeb, in the late 17th century. And so by the early 18th century, virtually the entire Indian subcontinent was under the control of the great Mughals. The richest territory of the Mughal Empire was Bengal, which was acquired in the last quarter of the 16th century. It's that region tinted in rose next to Burma. Another important region was that of the Marathas of the Deccan Plain, which straddles the boundary between the rose-colored territory and to the south, the beige-colored territory, that was also inhabited by the princes of Hyderabad. In the northwest was the Safavid Empire, the last great flowering of Persian culture. The Safavids ruled out of Tabriz. And farther to the west, of course, was the great Ottoman Empire with its capital in Istanbul. Since antiquity, India had long been prized for its luxury goods, its amazing fabrics like cotton, its dyes like indigo, its exotic spices, semi-precious stones, and ivory. The Roman Empire for a number of centuries had maintained seaborne trade with India in search of these fabulous goods. But after the decline of the Roman Empire in the 5th century, it would take many centuries for trade contacts between Europe and the subcontinent to really be renewed. It was the Portuguese who were the first Europeans to sail there for the purpose of trade, first arriving by ship in May 1498. The closing of the traditional trade routes in Western Asia by the Ottoman Empire in rivalry with the Italian states had sent Portugal in search of an alternate sea route to India. The first successful voyage to India was, of course, by the Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama in 1498, when after sailing around the Cape of Good Hope, he arrived in Calicut. Unfortunately, I don't have a pointer and my cursor is of no use, but if you look on the western south coast of India, so if you go down to the very tip and then go up a little ways, you'll see above the port of Cochin, you'll see Calicut. The Portuguese also established trading posts on the island of Ceylon to the south, present-day Sri Lanka, of course, near the capital of Colombo, very early on. Also at Matara, and then if you go up the western coast near in the south, they also established a port at Nagapattam, Trincomalee, and other successful trading posts. But their most successful and probably most famous colonial outpost was Goa. And again, that's on the western coast. It's kind of midway. If you kind of go up the coastline, you'll see Goa, established in 1510 by Captain Alfonso de Albuquerque. And Albuquerque, after conquering Goa, which had been controlled by Muslims, inaugurated a policy of marrying his Portuguese soldiers and sailors with local Indian girls. Another feature of the Portuguese presence in India was their willingness to evangelize and promote Catholicism. And in this, the Jesuits, of course, would play a very, very important role. Even today, the famous Jesuit missionary Francis Xavier is revered among the Catholics of India. Early on, the major rival of Portuguese was Holland, with the establishment of the Dutch East India Company in 1602. Now, the Dutch had the monopoly on the spice trade in the Malacca Straits, way off there in the Far East. No other colonial power really was able to overtake them. But the Dutch also would establish a foothold in the subcontinent and a number of outposts on Ceylon, nearby many of the Portuguese outposts. And they also established major presence on the western coast with Pulicat, with the colony of Nayagapatam, and a number of other outposts as well. But they proved no match to the Portuguese, and the British arrival would, for the most part, be a major blow to a Dutch presence and Dutch success in the subcontinent. Portugal had managed to hold on to its preeminent position primarily because of the famous Treaty of Tordesillas that was negotiated by the Pope in 1494, just 2 years after Columbus had reached the New World. This treaty had been created to divide the New Worlds between the Catholic countries of Portugal and Spain. In effect, they had carved up these new worlds with Spain receiving a monopoly of power in most of South America and Portugal in the East Indies. So working together, these two Catholic countries were able to maintain an effective blockade of these new markets for the majority of the 16th century. But the lure of potential wealth of the East was just too much for the rising Protestant powers of England and Holland. But little England, with its small ships, could not go up against the mighty Portuguese caravels and Spanish galleons. So it turned to illegal activity, namely buccaneering and piracy, which had been sanctioned by Queen Elizabeth herself. English sailors would resort to piracy of the Portuguese ships as they headed to Europe with their fabulously valuable cargoes. It was with the era of Sir Francis Drake looting and shooting his way around the world that the first cracks appeared in the Catholic monopoly. In fact, it was Drake's victory over the Spanish Armada in 1588 that really opened the floodgates. The navies of the Catholic countries were no longer strong enough to ensure an effective blockade of their new worlds. So we now see English and Dutch ships beginning to pass the Cape of Good Hope in increasing numbers. Both countries quickly establish chartered companies to exploit the commercial possibilities presented to them. So in 1600, Queen Elizabeth I, Elizabeth Regina, granted a royal charter to the English East India Company. Also known as the Governor and Company of Merchants of London, it pioneered the concept of a joint stock ownership. This was one of the great financial innovations of the Tudor dynasty. The company asked for and received a monopoly on all English trade in Asia. To that end, its royal charter granted the small private company unusual governing powers. This included the right to mint coins, establish and execute justice, and even to wage war when necessary. The East India Company would, over time, become the most powerful multinational corporation the world had ever seen. So 4 centuries before Google, Amazon, Facebook, etc., we have a company with immense power, granted a state-sanctioned monopoly and even the right to level taxes overseas. Now, trading with the East Indies not only allowed England to gain needed products, but also allowed them to learn how to manufacture these goods for themselves. Initially, the British were paying a lot of money for these products because they simply did not have a choice. But as time went on, they were able to manufacture some of the products for a fraction of the cost at home. And there was another reason for trading with India, and that was related to fashion. Fashion in England was becoming more important for the upper classes, and India had everything one needed to be fashionable. The East India Company had discovered that the exploitation of fashion for profit was a more artful business than a mere dictatorship exercised by trade. The British hoped trade of this cloth and fabric would help start a booming fashion industry, and they weren't wrong. Understanding the ocean and general geography was a necessity for the island kingdom of England. So, for example, in times of war, the British would be able to navigate more effectively with an understanding of the ocean and what it was doing. As mentioned earlier, the East India Company was given sweeping powers, even the power to declare war, especially with those who refuse trade or negotiate trade compacts. Of course, this applied only to non-Christians. As mentioned before, because of England's small fleet of ships, it could in no way do battle with the superior ships of the Portuguese. And the English knew that through trade and navigation, they would eventually be able to get the upper hand, especially with the rising power of France. The British monarchy believed that it did not need a strong army to dominate France, and they were not wrong in this assessment. Mastering trade and navigation would advance English interests and advance it as an empire. At the same time as Elizabeth I was signing the East India Company into existence in 1600, her counterpart in India, the Mughal Emperor Akbar, later known as Akbar the Great, was ruling over an empire some 750,000 square miles. The Mughals ruled over a vast and diverse land of deserts, large navigable rivers, thick forests, grasslands, and mountains. The empire stretched from northern Afghanistan in the northwest to central India's Deccan Plateau in the south and the Assamese highlands in the northeast. Many of the Mughal Empire's physical barriers separated various linguistic, religious, and ethnic groups. There were religious Sikhs in the Punjab to the west. We find Muslims in Bengal to the east, Hindu Maratha tribes in the Deccan Plateau. In the south, we find Tamil speakers and Hindu princes in Hyderabad. The highest mountain in the world, the Himalayas, blocked interaction with China. Invaders before the British came overland from the northwest from what is today Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Iran. The Mughals were of Afghan origin, spoke a Turkish dialect, and were very much influenced by Persian customs and culture, in their clothing, in their food, and in court protocol. By 1600, the Mughal Empire, which had been founded by Akbar's grandfather, Babur, in around 1526, had come of age and was embarking on a century of strong, centralized power, military dominance, and cultural productiveness that would mark the rule of the great Mughals. The Mughal court possessed a wealth and a magnificence to overshadow anything that Europe could produce at that time, while India's natural produce and that of its artisans was coveted all over the world. By the end of the 17th century, the new Mughal Empire ruled nearly the entire subcontinent of India. By then, it controlled 1.5 million square miles of land, and its population hovered around 160 million. When the East India Company first visited the Mughal court in the early 17th century, it was as supplicants, attempting to negotiate favorable trading relationships with Akbar's successor, Jahangir. Initially, the English were brushed aside because the Portuguese still enjoyed favor with the Mughal court. Also, Portuguese Jesuits sought to frustrate Protestant England's attempts at making inroads into this part of the world. But it was also due to the fact that the English really didn't have products of value to the Mughals. The English at this time really didn't produce anything that was even remotely of interest to what was effectively an Indian superpower. This would certainly remain the case for many years to come, and it would force the English to trade precious gold and silver for the spices and commodities of India. But a breakthrough did come in 1608 with the arrival of Captain William Hawkins at the court of Jahangir. Hawkins succeeded in obtaining a royal grant for the East India Company to set up factories on the western coast of India. Under the factory system, English representatives called factors set up England's trading posts. They also were involved in the sourcing of products and negotiating favorable trade with locals. And then in 1612, the English scored a decisive victory over the Portuguese, who had control of the pilgrim sea route to Mecca, which was very much resented by the Mughals. 6 years later, the embassy of Sir Thomas Roe to the Mughal court secured an accord in the form of a firman by which the English secured the right to trade and to establish factories in return for becoming essentially the naval auxiliary of the empire. This success, along with England's exclusion from Indonesia by the Dutch, determined that India, and not the Far East, should be the chief theater of English activity in Asia. Here's a map of the Mughal Empire from the first quarter of the 16th century to the very early 18th century. In the north, the sort of purplish, that's the ancestral home of the Mughals early on. And then over the next 150 years, they began to penetrate south. Eventually, by the early 18th century, they controlled virtually the entire subcontinent of India. And as I mentioned, they ruled over disparate peoples. So in the northwest, the green area, the Punjab, the land of the Sikhs. In the east, Far East, you had Bengal with a heavy Muslim population. In the center region, just where the orange meets sort of that rose color, that's the famous Deccan Plateau of the Hindu Maratha tribes. In the south, you have the Tamil tribes and the great princes of Hyderabad. The East India Company benefited from imperial patronage by maintaining very favorable relations with the great Mughals, especially Emperor Jahangir. As a private company with little support from the crown, it prudently adopted policies aimed at winning the favor of the Mughal court. Sir Thomas Roe, who had been the British ambassador to India, could easily discern the futility of European attempts to increase their profits by supporting costly military campaigns. He had given the directors of the East India Company some very sound advice already in 1619. He said, "Let this be received as a rule, that if you will profit, seek it at sea and in quiet trade. For without controversy, it is an error to affect garrisons and land wars in India." On the other hand, the Portuguese and Dutch traders were organized as state-run concerns, and they were relentlessly audacious in their approach to the Mughal emperor. The EIC was rewarded and allowed to expand its commercial trading operations. The East India Company overtook the Portuguese holding company known as Estado da India, which had established its trading posts in cities like Bombay, present-day Mumbai, Chittagong, and of course, Goa. As trade increased, so did the company's fortunes, and by 1620, the East India Company could claim over a dozen trading posts in the Indian Ocean and roughly 35 large ships. Indian merchants in coastal cities wanted European gold and silver, and towards the end of the 17th century, Indian pepper had become less important for global trade. The EIC profited mostly from Indian cotton, Chinese silk, followed by indigo, saltpeter, which is potassium nitrate used for the making of gunpowder, coffee, and tea. By the last quarter of the 17th century, Indian textiles accounted for well over 80% of all British trade from Asia. The British could find little that the Indians wanted to exchange. Obviously, it was too hot in the tropics to wear British wool, so the company exported tons of gold and silver to India. After establishing a presence at a port, the East India Company sought to construct a fort to protect its investment. So, for example, Portugal gifted the city of Bombay to the King of England, Charles II, upon his marriage to the Portuguese princess, Catherine of Braganza. Part of her dowry was the city of Bombay, which became now a possession of the English. The directors of the EIC now moved their headquarters to Bombay, lured by the security of a crown colony. As the directors wrote, "Though our business is only in trade and security, not conquest, yet we dare not trade boldly or leave great stocks where we have not the security of a fort, because there was always fear of piracy and the stealing of gold and silver by aggressive Portuguese and Dutch competitors." In 1634, Emperor Jahangir granted a firman to the English, allowing them to trade in the very rich province of Bengal to the east. In addition, he completely waived customs duties for their trade. As mentioned, most of the EIC's profits were from the trading of Indian cotton, dyes like indigo, saltpeter, coffee, and tea. Meanwhile, the Dutch East India Company dealt largely with the trade of spice. Both carved out their own little niche in respect of trade. However, this did not stop the EIC from trying to intrude on the Dutch's spice trade. The Dutch were very aggressive competitors, and they had now a virtual monopoly on the spice trade in the Straits of Malacca by altogether ousting the Portuguese. So with Portuguese fortunes on the decline, the British and the Dutch now entered into a period of very, very intense competition. And this would result in a series of wars in the 17th and early 18th century known as the Anglo-Dutch Wars. The East India Company had to exert a great deal of energy to safeguard its interests, and we find it spending huge sums of money on bribes in the process. As its assets increased, the network they possessed in India assumed a more permanent character. So they set about to build a string of forts, including Fort St. George in the southeastern city of Madras, and this one you see in front of you, constructed in 1690. This is Fort William in the northeastern city of Calcutta. By 1700, the East India Company had grown so large, it dominated the global trade in textiles. The prosperity that many of the officers of the company enjoyed allowed them to return to Britain and build sprawling estates and businesses, and also to obtain enormous political influence. So much so that they were able to develop a lobby in the English Parliament. By the early 1700s, India accounted for more than 20% of the world's gross domestic production. Historically, Bengal in the northeast had long been the richest region in the Mughal Empire. This region was famous for its magnificent textiles, one of which you see to the right, in silk and in cotton. In 1717, the Mughals granted the EIC a special privilege, a firman, that exempted it from taxes in Bengal. The export of fabrics from Bengal to England exploded in the first quarter of the 18th century. These textiles became the rage, highly desired by the fashion industry. Among these fabrics, still very famous even today, were chintz, also calico, muslin, dungarees, and gingham. India made calico soon surpass native British wool as the most popular textile in England. Unfortunately, this negatively affected the local weaving industry. It led in 1697 to riots by London's textile workers, and even assaults on the property of the EIC directors. And a short time later, many women wearing calico were beaten up in the streets of London. Parliament's response was to restrict the importation of calico and ban the use of powered looms in Bengal. Over the next 60 or 70 years, the East India Company's business increased to as much as 15% of the total annual imports coming into Britain. Its taxes and other payments, more often than not, kept the British government solvent. From the EIC's headquarters in London, instructions would be sent around the world regarding what goods should be purchased and the price to be paid. In retrospect, we can see the East India Company as the first imperial corporation, the very design of which drove it to market domination and speculative excess. Like many of today's multinationals, the EIC was eager to avoid the mere interplay of supply and demand. It jealously guarded its chartered monopoly of imports from India and Asia, but also, as we will see in our next lecture, it wanted to control the sources of supply by breaking the power of local rulers in India and eliminating competition so that it could force down its purchase prices. Eventually, by controlling both ends of the chain, the East India Company could buy cheap and sell quite high. As we will see in our next lecture, this meant organizing coups against local rulers and placing puppet Maharajas on the throne during the waning years of the Mughal Empire. As we shall see, by the middle of the 1700s, the East India Company was deliberately breaching the terms of its commercial concessions in Bengal by trading in prohibited domestic goods and selling its duty-free passes to local merchants. By combining economic muscle with extensive bribery and the deployment of its small but powerful private armies, the East India Company engineered a series of revolutions that gave it territorial as well as economic control.